Alright, now listen here, Ashen Puddle. Ashen Puddle. Whatever your name is. Now, for this next picture, you really have to give it your all. Give him the old razzle-dazzle, and you'll have them eating out of the palm of your hands. Take me, for instance. Pay attention now. A dream is a wish your heart makes when you're fast asleep. Oh, sing it, Papa. In dreams you will lose your heartaches. And let me tell you, whatever you wish for, you keep. Oh, I swear you keep. Have faith in your dreams, and someday, for you see, your rainbow welcomes smiling through. No matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true. Let me tell you,
Oh, sagen Sie, das war sehr gut gemacht. Darf ich es von hier aus übernehmen?
Sure thing, kid. Make me proud. Okay. Ich habe in Traum gesehen und das Glück war nah. Im Traum dürft ich zu hingehen, doch nun ist deine Wirklichkeit da. Ich glaub an das Glück, denn einmal wird wieder alles anders sein. Drum glaub ich, na wird ich sehen, ich muss nur so in gehen, das Leben, es lag mir dann so. Well, I guess you win this round, but someday there'll be a rematch, and it'll be bigger and better than ever.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Disney Reel to Reel, a deep, deep, deep delve into the Disney animated canon. So deep that I hope you all figured out by now that this is a BYOS event. It's a bring your own slipper event. So, yeah. Nice. I try. And joining me today for our discussion of Cinderellas from 1922 is my scholarly companion, Abigail Fine, returning again. Welcome back.
Thank you. Hello, it's great to be back.
Yes. So I wanted to open up with another question for you, like we did with our last discussion. Something a little bit more personal to you. Is there a Disney princess that you identify with?
Ooh, I mean, growing up, my favorite Disney princess, well, the one I identified with most was Belle. The one I wanted to be was Jasmine because I thought she was hotter, but I identified more with Belle. I was definitely a bookworm, and I have brown hair, and everyone said I looked like her. So yeah, I think it was Belle. And also the I want adventure and the great wide somewhere ethos really resonated with me. All the Disney princesses kind of want that, but Belle really spells it out. So probably Belle.
I don't want to get married. Oh, man. Hey y'all, Editing Wyatt popping in to say, I never shared which Disney princess I identify with in the initial recording, oddly enough. Prior to this discussion, I would have said that I relate to Cinderella herself, due to having similar family dynamics, resilience, patience, and compassion for others. But now... Well, I won't get too in-depth, but I once gave a catfisher an absurd amount of money, and if that doesn't make me an Anna, I don't know what does. And I would have married them on sight, but thank God I have a few Elsas in my corner. Anyway, back to the show. I guess it's a good enough place to start our discussion on Cinderellas, mainly ones done by Lottie Reiniger and a little fella named Walt Disney, who I believe was 21 at the time of the release of his Cinderella.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So, right off the bat, I'm going to ask you a very loaded question, and it's so loaded that I think I might want to go ahead and answer first.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is, what are your prior associations with Cinderella?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'll go first. I'd say that Cinderella, of all the fairy tales that Walt Disney was around to adapt into feature films, Cinderella came into my radar like the latest. Snow White obviously was there from the get-go. Like, I merely like just popped out of the womb, and there might as well have been playing on like a TV screen in the hospital or something. I was like, that is my calling. And Sleeping Beauty, it preceded Cinderella, but it was sort of like a movie that I didn't really gravitate towards because I think it was a bit more, I don't know. I kind of have a weird vibe with Sleeping Beauty because on one hand, the storytelling, it is a little more realistic, but it's also mega stylized. It's just that weird, it's kind of an imbalance to me in some places. And Cinderella, it came up, and of course, being a boy, you have to deal with those wonderful gender roles that are like, you're not supposed to like the princess movies. So Cinderella was the one that I was not exactly like discouraged from watching, but sort of the one that I was like, okay, this is, of the three, this is clearly the girl movie. You know?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
could see that.
Yeah. Did you ever have any experiences with that, with like either the Disney princess films or any that deal with like gender roles for children and adults?
Did I experience thinking about that when I was a kid, you mean?
Yes.
Um, I don't think really. I think that for the most part, Disney films, if you're a girl, people just kind of assume you're gonna like them all. And they, like even Robin Hood, you love Robin Hood, but it's because the fox is foxy. Like nobody's like you're doing something weird and outside of a prescribed gender role. And while my parents are not like I mean, they're not like people who were, dressing me in androgynous clothes. They weren't like feminist of the 1980s kind of parents. They were still very much about how I could be and do whatever I wanted when I grew up. So they never really forced any gender roles on me. But then again, I was also the girl that refused to wear any kind of trousers until I was like in fourth grade, and I would only wear dresses and skirts. So I kind of put myself into those gender roles and they just went with it. But yeah, growing up, my parents were always very much like, you don't have to get married. You don't have to have kids. If you do get married, you don't have to change your last name. My dad took me to see Elizabeth with Kate Blanchett in the theater when I was far too young to go see that in the theater. But he was like, Queen Elizabeth's an excellent role model and that's who you should be. So we just went to see it. So yeah, it was that kind of upbringing where they were very on board with me being interested in princesses, but they did keep pushing me towards like, Princess Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, sort of these more what we might now term quote unquote girl boss kind of royalty figures. But yeah.
And now that you just cracked that shell, I have to say, as like a bit of ASMR, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss.
Wait, what's that from?
Have you not seen ContraPoints?
I mean, I've seen not that one then. I know of ContraPoints, but I don't know that one.
Okay, I can't remember exactly which one it was in, but that was one of her many phrases that she threw around.
I'll have to go watch more of ContraPoints. Yeah, I watch a lot of Lindsay Ellis before she quit YouTube, but hadn't gotten as into ContraPoints.
Yeah. So now the 50-pound question is being handed over to you.
Oh, yes. So prior experience with Cinderella. Well, as a child, I did see Cinderella, and I clearly saw it before I was 4 years old because I was 4 years old the first time I visited Disney World. And I don't remember this, but apparently my parents put me into one of the Disney daycares for a night so they could go out and have dinner, the two of them. And I got into a huge shouting match with another kid at the daycare about how Cinderella was real when he tried to tell me that it was just an actress in the parks. And I was not having it. I was like, that is Cinderella. And I don't think you know what you're talking about. He was right in retrospect. But I didn't believe him. And then, yeah, the bigger thing with me and Cinderella is that I am working on a PhD that I am meant to be submitting here in a couple months that is all about Cinderella adaptations from 1922 to 2021 in Britain and America. So I have read and watched almost every British and American version of Cinderella from 1922 to 2021 in the past 4 years that I've been working on this thesis, I guess.
That is some major commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah. But to be fair, you're not alone in thinking that Cinderella is not a real person, because I remember a story. Eileen Woods, who was the voice of Cinderella in the 1950 film, she recalled taking her daughter to see it, either on its first premiere or a release in another city or what have you. And her daughter knew instantly that that was her mom up there singing in.
Well, so we were reversed then, because she knew that Cinderella was her mom. I was like, Cinderella in the parks is Cinderella from the film. And I thought this kid was totally wrong.
Yeah, but she also did recall a mother turned over to them and she was like, oh, isn't that sweet? She thinks her mom's Cinderella.
That's pretty great.
Yeah. Oh, man. So which one do you want to tackle first?
Up to you. I mean, they're both pretty different.
Okay. Well, I think we should start with Lottie Reiniger's first, because cool. I think it was released first. Did you bring along any production notes?
I brought along notes about Lottie Reiniger. I don't have notes specifically about this Cinderella necessarily, but I have sort of an overview of Lottie Reiniger, so I can share with the class. Lottie Reiniger was a German animator and artist who was born in Berlin in 1899, which interestingly is only, if I am doing my math right, 42 years after the last edition of the Grimm's Tales was published, because the Brothers Grimm published their seminal set of fairy tales between 1812 and 1857. Lottie Reiniger wanted to pursue acting. So as a teenager, she convinced her parents to enroll her in Max Reinhardt's drama school. And she was very adept, as we will discuss, at cutting out silhouettes. So doing paper cuttings of people. And she sold silhouettes of the stars of the productions to help pay for her tuition. And one reason that she had wanted to go to this school, according to a New York Times article, is that she had gone to a lecture about the fantastic possibilities of animation and had got really invested in that. And a German actor-director named Paul Wegener noticed her cutouts and hired her to do titles for his 1916 feature Rumpelstiltskin's Wedding, and then his 1918 feature The Pied Piper of Hamelin. And I think both of those were live action, but they were silent films because, of course, this is the 19-teens. So she was doing the title cards for it because he thought that the cuttings were so beautiful. This led to her first independent film. So through Wegener and her work with him, she got funded through the Institute for Cultural Research in Berlin with a guy named Hans Kurlis and a guy named Karl Koch, who she later married. And then she and Karl Koch continued to work on their films together until he died, I think, in the 1960s. I think early 1960s is when he died. But they worked together until then. But she did her first feature with them in 1919 called Ornament of the Loving Heart. This got her a job at an ad agency, and she managed to fund 4 short films through her ad agency job, including the 1922 Aschenputtel. The success of those shorts got a banker named Louis Hagen to finance her first and the world's first feature-length animated film called The Adventures of Prince Ahmed, which came out in 1926. There's a little disagreement around whether Prince Ahmed was the first feature-length animated film, because there is a sort of, we hear tell of a film from 1917 that might have been feature length. It was called, I think, The Apostle, but there's no full copy still extant anymore, so it's hard to say whether or not it actually was. But we know for sure that Prince Ahmed was, and that came out more than a decade before Snow White. And then in 1928, she did Dr. Dolittle, which was another animated feature-length film. And then she had some other collaborators involved with her work, including Walter Ruttmann and Bertold Bartosch. The New York Times called her style of animation Scherenschnitte, and it talks about how this Scherenschnitte, which was silhouette art, originated in China as a form, which I do not doubt that it did. But silhouette cutting, by the time that Lottie Reiniger was a kid, was already super popular in Europe. It had been popular, I think, starting around the 18th century, but primarily as a women's art form. So I know this English author, poet named Anna Letitia Barbauld, who lived in the mid 18th century, was really into silhouette art. So it was a centuries long in Europe traditional women's art form. And there's something really interesting, I think, about bringing that silhouette art form to the screen as her animated art form. An article I read by a guy named William Moritz said that silhouette films served as a kind of feminist validation of a woman's art form, which I thought was an interesting point. There's a lot of stuff about sort of the feminist reads that you can make on Lottie Reiniger's work. Then we had the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And while Lottie Reiniger, I don't know, I think she was in a demographic that the government was not going after, but she was not comfortable with the government. She disagreed with Nazi policies. So she and her husband immigrated from Germany. They didn't have any permanent visa anywhere. So they had some really unstable years where they were going back and forth between England and France on visitor visas. They had friends in France, I know. Jean Renoir was one of her good friends and collaborators. But then, of course, France had its own issues with Nazi Germany and got occupied. So they had some really unsettled years. Eventually, they settled in England, where she lived for most of her life and started doing some film work with the BBC again near the end of her life. According to the William Moritz article that I read, she had a lot of friends who were socialists and communists, including Bertolt Brecht and, as I said a second ago, Jean Renoir. And Moritz points to a 1934 film of hers called The Stolen Heart as an anti-Nazi parable. She was also very pro-homosexuality, which is rare and awesome for her time period, especially in Germany. Though I guess Berlin pre-Third Reich actually was a much more open place for gender and sexuality experimentation than a lot of other places, if the musical of Cabaret and Christopher Isherwood's Berlin Stories are anything to go by. But according to Moritz, there is a male kiss in Prince Ahmed between the emperor and a character named Ping Pong, but I have not actually seen the film to confirm that, though I have no reason to doubt the article that I read.
Well, that will be a subject that we'll tackle in a later episode. So,
yeah, cool, awesome.
So we'll see.
So that is what I have on Lottie Reiniger. I am not a Lottie Reiniger specialist. My friend Tashi Petter is. So if you want to go look up some of her work, you can. She would be all over this. Most of my work is on American animation, not German animation, but it is fun to
Mhm.
go and read about other animation and art traditions.
Yeah. Also, just catching up on some points that you made throughout your wonderful biography. Um, I'm saying this for the people in the back. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was not the world's first full-length animated film. Understand?
This is very true. Though, to be fair, I believe it was the world's first hand drawn animated film. So,
Oh yeah, it's cell animated and
yeah.
musical fantasy, all that stuff. Technicolor,
It
glorious Technicolor.
did do a lot of pioneering. But Lottie
Yeah,
Reiniger does get left out of a lot of histories of animation.
yeah. And it's really a shame because I can't think of anyone who has that sort of style in their filmography that doesn't do it with like the help of computers or something.
Yes, Michel Ocelot does some movies that currently have her sort of silhouette style. I believe Princes and Princesses came out in 2000, and he did another one. I think it might have been the 1001 Nights, but I'm not positive, that came out a few years after that. Because I know she did a lot with the stories from the 100 or the 1001 Nights. But yeah, but Michelle Ocelot, if you want like a look at her style, I highly recommend Princes and Princesses.
Okay. So we understand now that her choice in doing silhouette cutout animation was primarily to acknowledge her work as a woman and to accentuate the attention to detail that is typically associated with
Mm,
um, women's projects and crafts and such. And that can sort of be extended to Disney in the sense of like, not a lot of ink and paint girls were credited for their
yeah,
work on a lot of
yeah,
films, and yet we remember their product almost as well, if not more, than that of the animators or the voice talent or the orchestras.
yeah, for sure. The ink and paint girls did so much of the detail work that later films don't have. And you can really
Mm-hmm.
see when they sort of lost the budget for the detailing that the women in ink and paint did. And yeah, there were so many great animators, I think, that were lost to ink and paint. um, there were a few women animators. There's a really great book, Queens of Animation by Nathalia Holt, that goes into the women at Disney. And then I think let me double check who wrote ink and paint. I think it's Mindy Johnson.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. But yes, so Mindy Johnson's ink and paint book, I think, is a really good one as well.
Uh, I mean, I'm honestly not sure about Queens of Animation because, unlike Mindy Johnson's book, it doesn't provide a lot of quotations from the women.
Well, okay, so this is going to be because Mindy Johnson is publishing through Disney Press. So
Mm-hmm.
she is able to have access to archives, and Disney doesn't let scholars, independent or affiliated with university scholars. So scholars who are independent of Disney are no longer allowed into the Disney archives. So people working on Disney, like myself, don't actually have access to the archives, which hinders attempts at getting quotes from documents that are held in the Disney collection. I really do enjoy Queens of Animation, and I think it brings up a lot of good points. I, like you, do have some reservations about her methodology, and I do think that it is lacking in citations. When you go to look at her bibliography, she does document things, but there are things that she documents that are like conversations with people and things like that, which are important. Oral history is an important form of conversation, or of research, and of maintaining this information for future generations, but it would be nice to have some kind of publicly available transcript of whatever conversation she had with family members. There were several points where I kind of flagged bits and was like, how do you know this? She writes it a little bit like creative nonfiction at times, and I
Mm-hmm.
prefer my scholarly work to be not creative nonfiction, but I did still think she had some really good points about some of the stuff happening at Disney at the time that maybe Disney wouldn't actually put into any of their published works because they're really invested in brand integrity.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'd say that my only other reservation is that in this day and age where a lot of women don't believe that there has been a precedent set in God knows how many professional fields, like not just including animation, but they feel like they are the ones now who are breaking through the glass ceiling when in fact it's already happened before.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I just feel like maybe the issue I had also was that Queens of Animation focuses more on their personal lives in
Mm.
ways that that are interesting, but they do feel a little invasive at times.
Mm.
Whereas Ink and Paint, I feel like it focuses more on what people actually want to hear, which is their professional accomplishments.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, I felt like some of the stuff with Mary Blair in particular in Queens of Animation was not documented enough. That's where I mostly had my issues with the book, was that I didn't feel like she documented enough of what she put in the book for me to 100% accept as fact what she had written. And the way that she wrote it, as I said, was a little bit like creative nonfiction, which made me think, well, were you there when these incidents happened? Like, and if not, where are you getting the information to say so certainly that some of these very private moments that only Mary and Lee Blair were there for happened when
Mm-hmm.
both of them have been dead for a while, and you
Yeah.
obviously didn't talk to them, and you didn't cite like this was written in a letter or something like that.
Were you there when all of those men laughed at that woman during a story meeting?
Oh, the Bianca Majoli one.
Yeah, were you all laughing at Bianca? Were you there like 80 years ago?
Yeah, I do feel like that one gets a little bit more credibility in Didier Guez's series, They Drew
Mm-hmm.
as They Pleased, when he talks about Bianca's legacy at Disney. Like, there is some more about how difficult she found her time. But I think that your concerns about the writing style and maybe the lack of documentation for some of how she presents her information in that book are concerns that I shared while reading it.
Yeah, yep, yep. I only bring it up because we're now in an age where information, regardless of citations, can be shared anywhere and people can believe it
Mm-hmm.
without having a second thought.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's going to be credible, I just want documentation.
Yeah, I think my advice to anybody doing research in any field, but especially when looking at stuff around Disney, is like flip to the back and see who cited it and where the citations came from. And if you could actually go and find these storyboards or these letters or these memos again to replicate the research.
Mm-hmm. That's why I just wish all blessings on Didier Guez, because his editions of various books through Theme Park Press, they always have this blurb at the very beginning that's like, what these people said may or may not be true because everyone has their own
Yeah.
motivations and ends that they're trying to achieve when retelling a story or what have you. Or things might be altered or forgotten or details here and there. So just check your sources. All right. Well, I guess before we get into the shorts proper, I could go ahead and talk a little bit about Walt Disney, because we're only tackling the first 20 years of his life.
Mm-hmm.
No big deal. Um, so he was born on the 5th of December, 1901, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the fourth son of Elias Disney and Flora Disney, who were both Irish. and Flora was an American of German and English descent. He also had his brother Roy, as well as Herbert and Raymond, and he even had a little sister named Ruth, who was born in December 1903. 3 years after Ruth's birth, they moved to a farm in Marceline, Missouri, thanks to his uncle Robert acquiring some land for agriculture and whatnot. And that is where Walt has been pretty good on record for saying that was among the happiest times of his life, because that's where he developed his like passion for art and creative expression and whatnot. And it was during this time that he was also developing an interest in drawing that led to doing commissions for various people and companies and whatnot. This is also where he developed his love for trains. I don't think there's a single place on physical Disney property where you may not find a train of some sort. You could go to the Walt Disney Family Museum. You could go to the Disney theme parks. You could go to... They may have miniatures at the studios or something, but I'm not entirely sure. But yes, he's a big train guy. And he spent several years going to primary school and getting his education. And then in 1911, they moved to Kansas City, Missouri. He also attended a grammar school there. And it seems that he met a fellow student named Walter Pfeiffer, who was very much into theatrics and vaudeville and the theater. And he spent a lot more time with that family, more so than his own, which ultimately led his father to have him and Roy be part of a newsboy group, sending newspapers to various homes within the city. And this was among the most grueling experiences of his life. It is mostly fact when Tom Hanks talks about it in Saving Mr. Banks. Getting the buckle end of Elias's old belt. It's terrible. And then he would go on to attend courses at the Kansas City Art Institute, where he took a course in cartooning. Then, in 1917, his father Elias bought stock in a Chicago jelly producer, the Ozell Company, and he moved back over there. And then Disney went on to go through high school and became the cartoonist of their school newspaper, which is fairly lovely because this was around the time of the First World War. So he's often making satirized cartoons about one of the great American atrocities. Over time, he developed this great sense of patriotism to go out and fight against the Germans alongside his brother, but he was rejected for being too young, even after faking his birth certificate, like you do. And then he was shipped to France, but he arrived after a truce had already been declared, or what have you. I don't actually know how the First World War ended. But, oh well. And but he did contribute by drawing cartoons on the side of his ambulance for decoration, and he did some art for their newspaper called Stars and Stripes. But then in October 1919, he made it back to Kansas City, and he decided to take up work at a commercial art studio, where he met a very integral part of the Disney machine, Iwerks. We'll get to it in later episodes, but this man may as well have been like a Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
Full-on genius. The amount of work that has built up his legacy and the Hollywood landscape in general. Not even just Hollywood, but just technology in general and entertainment. It's immeasurable. Also, around this time, Disney became part of an institution called Demolay, which was basically like a youth organization. And this hasn't been documented very much, which has led to some rumors about him being like a 33rd degree Freemason. which are not true, but he was a member of the Kansas City chapter. He applied on March of 2020. 2020. Oh, no.
Wow.
I know, he's a time traveler. 1920, excuse me. And yeah, I think that I can't say too much about this because aside from some speeches and some letters and some articles that he contributed to, like in the 60s and the 1930s and what have you, it does seem like that had an impact on the kind of films that he wanted to create, putting those good old Christian values in, what was it, like 19 of his feature films? His animated films, excuse me.
Are you talking about with the Freemasons?
No, not with the Freemason.
I was
I
like,
mean,
what are you...
it's all a conspiracy. Wait, what?
I was like, what?
Well, here's the thing. I'm pulling an article from the organization's website, and they had a blurb that said, "This is from a magazine that he wrote for in 1963. There was a writer named Roland Gammon who communicated with about 55 famous Americans, including Steve Allen, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Roy Rogers. And when he was asked, "What is your faith and what part has it played in your life achievement?" He wrote, "Deeds rather than words."
That feels pretty accurate.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, he's definitely a man that like keeps to his promises in terms of his own projects and stuff.
He was a doer. I want to quickly add, World War One apparently ended with the Armistice of Salonika and the Armistice of Germany. That's how it ended.
Okay.
Yeah, I was also like, there was armistice, but I was like, what did that? I mean, like, I know what an armistice is, but I was like, you're right. We talk so much about World War II that the end of World War One often gets kind of forgotten and rolled into like, well, then we had the 1920s and there was a flu before that.
Yeah, and then women got the right to vote.
Yay! Yeah.
Yeah. Then he went on to say, quote, "Later in Demolay, I learned to believe in the basic principle of the right of man to exercise his faith and thoughts as he chooses. In Demolay, we believe in a supreme being, in the fellowship of man, and the sanctity of the home. Demolay stands for all that is good for the family and for our country." Unquote. Yeah.
Okay, this is interesting because I haven't read this stuff in other biographies of him.
It is listed in an article from Demolay International. It's from 2018. The title is "The Most Famous Demolay of All, Walt Disney."
I see that, but yeah, I'm just wondering. I mean, yeah, okay, interesting.
Yeah. Like he had like a fairly regular correspondence with the organization even like 2 years after that statement. He had to just bring up how it's affecting the youths of America in 1965, even though it was kind of a boiling pot for social and human rights. So, oh man, kind of contradictory, but let's see. Got off track there a little bit.
No, we can cut this.
No. It's kind of important, not so much to the Cinderella adaptations, but just sort of a lot of people really hang on to Walt Disney as being this like reflection of American values and stuff like that, and I just wanted to find a route for a way that could have affected his work going forward. Because otherwise, I have no solid explanation.
Well, I mean, there's lots of things about Walt Disney's life that can be like I think that even without this order, he's living in a time period through his whole life. Like, just look at what happens between 1901 and 1966. The world's a completely different place. So he has a lot of ingrained patriotism and quote unquote American values that come with the end of World War I, and then especially World War II, where America comes out of it as a superpower. And he had been actively involved in propaganda films for World War II that,
Mm-hmm.
that, I mean, everybody in America, well, not everybody, but a lot of people in America came together for that war. And certainly the sort of ethos of that, of like, we're America and we won World War II, is, I think, still part of American culture. It's certainly part of British culture, the sort of wartime, keep calm and carry on. It's more than a meme. You get a lot of stuff here. And that tends to be people with more conservative values who harken back to this World War II era. Plus, in 1941, there was the studio strike at Disney,
Mm-hmm.
which really turned him against unions. He felt personally betrayed. And like, I think being anti-unionist is not great. But like, I've read some stuff that does make it clear why he felt like this was a personal betrayal. Like, he couldn't see it as just business because he felt like he had invested in these animators. And then, of course, it ended up costing a lot more to hire animators after the union strike. And I think that really pushed him maybe a little bit further right after the union strike as well. And then that, of course, led into World War II. I mean, not the strike itself, but the time
Mm-hmm.
period of it. We had 1941 into World War II. So he had a lot going on there. And then the 1950s, you just get the whole backlash from the whole country from World War II. You get the men coming back, women who had been in the workforce going back into the homes, the baby boom. So I think there's lots going on in his life that could account for the sort of ideology that he espouses in his films, that just have to do with him really honestly both following the mainstream waves, but then also near the end especially starting to shape those mainstream waves as Disney becomes a more popular and more culturally invasive studio within his lifetime. So yeah, I think he definitely had some more right-leaning values. Like, he was very, very anti-communist, definitely involved in all that that's going on in the 50s. But I think that as a man, I think there is such I think it's hard to find the man Walt Disney right now under the layers and layers of mythologizing that have been done about him, both by the Walt Disney Company itself, by fans of the Walt Disney Company, and then on the other side, I think you get too harsh of a backlash to him at times. You hear about how he's anti-Semitic. And if you're like, well, what's the evidence for that? You go and read it. And maybe there's a few things that aren't great, but there's nothing that seems, usually the things that they point to are pre-World War II, for one thing, which a lot of mainstream white artists pre-World War II had hints of anti-Semitism because that was just unfortunately the culture at the time. Like, Agatha Christie has some real bad anti-Semitism in her pre-World War II books. And then you hear, oh, he's not a feminist, he wasn't feminist, but actually he did incorporate a lot of women. And maybe he's not feminist in the way that we want him to be feminist in a post, like, third, fourth wave feminist movement. Yeah, like there were the ink and paint girls who got overlooked for animation positions. There were some not great things at the studios that happened that you're like, well, this feels like, but I don't think that he was more overtly misogynist than anybody else. And in fact, I think he was a lot less misogynist than a lot of animators at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's a nuanced and complicated man. And I think that it's really hard to find that nuance anymore, because we're living in a world where nuance isn't acceptable. You kind of have to be all in on what one person wants you to be all in on, and if you deviate even slightly, that means that you're all the other way. We're living in an age of real extremes. And then he died, God, in 66. How many years ago is that now? Like, ages ago. um
Is it like
yeah
60 years ago?
Yeah, but in that time, Disney as a corporation has become its own thing, and they have used Walt Disney in their own self-mythologizing. So the man has become, I think, a kind of figurehead. He is full of witty quips and welcome to the happiest place ever, and he is Mickey Mouse, even though he didn't ever really draw Mickey Mouse. It was all Ub Iwerks drawing Mickey Mouse. But you sort of get this like Walt and Mickey are one and the same, and it's like, well, and so I just think that there's a lot going on with Disney, and a lot going on with a larger American culture that can explain his decisions, which I do think are rooted probably in a more right-leaning political value system, and also probably in some kind of religious value system. But I guess maybe I'm hesitant to talk about him being like overtly religious or mystical, because I think right now in America, saying like I'm Christian has a lot of really poor associations with radical right-wing evangelical Christianity, and I do not think that he would have been subscribing to that kind of a mentality at this point. Like I can't see him being, I mean, and he could, a lot of people get sucked in by Fox News, but like I don't think that I don't think he was a radical right-wing religious figure either. Like I just think he was trying to find a real mainstream, broad cultural appeal to get as many people into his films as he could.
Yes, I'm in the same boat with you.
Yeah.
Basically, here's a way that I can phrase it that could probably put this all to rest. So 3 men got into bed with a mouse, and we created an empire.
Okay, who are the 3 men? Walt,
Roy, and Ub Iwerks.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if we were saying like Walt, Eisner, and Iger. Like...
Well, if that's the case, then Chapek's a rat. So.
Oh my god.
Oh my god. You know what? I'm not going to cut any of this out. This is a discussion that I knew was going to happen at some point with somebody, and I'm happy that we just got it out, like, right out the gate. So.
Oh, well, I hope that it's enlightening, and I hope it has done justice to a really difficult topic.
Yes.
I mean, there's lots of scholarship out there to go read.
Mm-hmm. Which I endorse you all to check out, please. But going back to 1921.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the company that he and Ub Iwerks were working with, their revenue declined in the winter of that year, so they were laid off, and they began their own business called the Eisner. Fuck, I almost said Eisner. The Iwerks Disney Commercial Artists. And they produced the Newman's Laugh-O-Gram series, which was made to compete with Paul Terry's Aesop Fables series of cartoons based in New York, which often like satirized fairy tales in like not so very what's the word I want to use? Great ways. But over time, they also lost money with this business as well. But they did produce shorts such as, I think their demo short was literally just called Newman Laugh-O-Grams. And I just find it so fascinating that the very first footage that we have that survives of anything that the Disney studio produced is of Walt himself at an animation desk.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just a wonderful bit of symmetry to it all that I find very satisfying. um, but one of the shorts which he produced was that of Cinderella. And it featured a lot of characters which he had used throughout the series. Like, the two lead characters were Susie and Jack, which obviously they made a Jack and the Beanstalk adaptation, so he fit right in there. um, and also a character called Julius the Cat, who would go on to another more lucrative series of cartoons for the Disney studio. So, I guess with that out of the way, we can talk about how these two icons of animation tackled the Cinderella story.
Yeah. So we have the silhouette paper cutout art for the Lottie Reiniger animation, and then we have hand-drawn, more like cell animation for the Walt Disney Cinderella.
Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of Reiniger's, it's interesting how she makes a point of having a silhouetted image of herself crafting the character of Cinderella.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's sort of a feminine inheritance,
Mm-hmm.
like an acquirement of the character by doing that, which is very interesting because typically the most well-known Cinderella stories have been told by men until very recently.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and then we go right into the first scene where we see how she is mistreated by her stepfamily. And it is very interesting that in one of the title cards, they refer to her as a slut.
Well, so that is interesting. I am assuming that this is because this is title cards that were made around 1922. They're in English, so we're not seeing the original German title cards. But I'm assuming that what we are seeing is a 1920s translation of whatever the German title cards were. And in the 1920s, I am guessing it was probably similar to a little bit earlier. Slut didn't have it had a sexual connotation, but it didn't mean slut the way that slut means now. So, like, the original Perrault translation of Cinderella, by Robert Samber in the 18th century, the mean older sister wants to call her Cinder Slut, and the nicer one wants to call her Cinderella. And so slut or sluttishness had more of a meaning of you're kind of not put together, you're dirty, but not necessarily with like the sexual connotation of what, like, oh, you're sleeping around, quote unquote, you're dirty.
Yeah,
because
she's not a promiscuous scullery maid.
Yeah, that's not really what it is. It's more just about like the earlier idea of sluttishness and that you're slovenly in your dress and that kind of thing. So I'm assuming that that is more what it meant when it called her a slut in the title card. I don't think they meant like, and Cinderella goes out and sleeps around.
Yeah.
Which, no judgment if that's what she was doing.
No.
But I do not think that that was the intent of the title card originally.
No, especially because in the Grimm story, we do not have any sort of fairy godmother to assist Cinderella. It is her mother talking to her from beyond the beyond.
Yeah, through a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that also changes a little bit over time. So the Grimms, throughout their editing of their tales, just edited it to be more and more and more patriarchal and Christian. So in their 1812 version, there's an article by someone named Nicole Thies that looks at the way that the Grimms edited Aschenputtel in particular, to in the 1812 version, which is probably the closest to the version that they heard from the storytellers that they were gathering from, there's a lot more of a pagan and matrilineal kind of vibe to it. So Cinderella's mother is more present in the beginning before she dies. She says slightly different things to Cinderella before she dies, and then she's very present in the tree, and there are a bunch of birds that actually talk to Cinderella so that she's not completely isolated throughout it. And then by the time that we get to 1857 and the final Grimm's editing, it's a lot more. The birds don't talk to her anymore. The birds only talk to the prince at the very end, but otherwise they don't speak. And the sort of mother spirit idea of the tree has been taken away a little bit. It's really interesting to compare it.
Mm-hmm. And then we see that they have received an invitation to the ball.
Mm-hmm.
And they decide to put Cinderella through a whole bunch of arbitrary tasks, including finding lentils within a pile of dirt. And she succeeds in her task, but she is still denied her wish to go to the ball. So sad. And then she goes over to weep at her mother's grave, and a flock of birds swarm her and bedeck her in this gown, this very ornate gown, complete with a cape. We love capes. And yet it's weird, like, in this adaptation, the way that they handled the birds seemed a bit disconcerting to me, because it reminded me of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds.
Well, that would not have been a touchstone for Lottie Reiniger.
No. But I mean, just the way that they envelop her and you think they're going to peck away at her.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I think we've all become a lot more skittish about birds since the 1920s.
Yes. She is provided with a coach. Because I believe in the Grimm's version, didn't she like run to and from the ball?
I don't think there is any explicit form of transportation in theirs. There's certainly not a pumpkin. She might end up with some kind of a coach, though. Like one might just appear. It does in the Giambattista Basile version. There's like a coach that appears, even though it has a similar tree dress narrative.
Tree dress.
There's like sort of a fairy in that one, but it goes away and leaves her with a tree. So yeah.
Also in the Grimm's adaptation, Cinderella's oh my god, the English language is failing me today.
You got this.
Yeah. Cinderella's father is very much alive and very much abusive.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, the dad tends to be alive in more of them than you would think. I don't even think he's explicitly dead in the Perrault. The mom is. Now I'm trying to remember if it says he is. He's not a character in it. He just kind of goes away, but I don't know that they say that he dies explicitly.
Because in the remake, they were like, when you're on your journey, bring me a branch that hits you along your journeys.
Yeah, that's more taken from a Beauty and the Beast adaptation. Yeah. And kind of the Basile one, but not quite. So the Giambattista Basile version is called The Cinderella Cat, and it was published posthumously in 1634, I believe. And in that one, the mom dies, and well, there's some murder that happens. The Cinderella character murders somebody, and then her dad remarries. It's a whole thing. Anyway, once she's become firmly the servant of the household in her own household, her dad is going on a trip to Sardinia, and because it's in Italy, because he was Italian, and all these fairy tales get adapted for where they are. And she tells her father when he gets to Sardinia to ask like the fairies of the island for whatever gifts they will give her, and they end up giving her like a seed and a silk handkerchief with which to water the seed. So it's kind of similar in that way, but not as nice or sentimental. Girl knows what she's up to in the Basile. She's not nice and innocent.
Yeah, she
And
no
that,
fool.
yeah, she's already murdered somebody. But yeah, so that one's a little bit different. So I could see it there, but it really much more reminds me of what we get with later Beauty and the Beast versions, where she is the kinder one. And instead of asking for silks and jewels like her horrible biological full sisters in Beauty and the Beast, she asks for a rose or something like that. And that then gets her dad in trouble. So it felt like they pulled from that narrative for the 2015 Disney film.
Okay. And I remembered that as well, but I was just sort of like, Perot had to have a reason. He had to have a reason.
Yeah, no, that's not in the pro.
Okay. Well, then I just haven't read it in many years, so
Yeah.
that's on me. But anyway, she makes it to the ball, and the prince and she fall in love at first sight, as you do. And when the clock strikes 12, bitch, getting the fuck out of there. And I guess, okay, I don't want to break down like every single moment of this film. But I remember in our last episode on Sleeping Beauty, I pretty poorly tried to ask you a question, which you gave me an excellent answer for. The question was pertaining to how we deal with romance in fairy tales in the 21st century. Now that we've had all of this wonderful schlock happen to us, and now we're all jaded, and love doesn't exist unless, I don't know, you got something going for you. I don't know what it is. Can somebody please tell me what it is? I need to know. No.
It's hope and faith and pixie dust.
No. I'll take it.
Solved your problem.
Yep. But I guess the real question I was trying to get at was, in the 21st century, we're having this kind of backlash to the romance in fairy tales, which part of which Disney has perpetuated. And I guess I was trying to get at a point where we have that mindset going through the 2000s and the 2010s for sure. But now that we're in an age where people aren't fully comfortable, like, even touching in like a platonic way, like, do you think that there might be a backlash to the backlash?
So what I'm hearing is early Disney films had a lot of like fairy tale romance where you meet one night and then the next day you're married kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then and also with like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, like let's kiss the asleep girl kind of thing, which I think we're all kind of agreeing is maybe a little bit not so great. And then in the 2010s we had like Frozen, where they self-referentially made fun of that. And then like where would we be with that now?
Yeah, and maybe that kind of relates to how, like, for example, like parents felt about little girls being attached to like the Disney princess brand and stuff like that, and them growing up with these unrealistic expectations for how their love life is going to go and stuff. I guess it's pretty complicated. It's like a bunch of all of those things coming together into our current like sociological melting pot we've got right now.
Yeah. I mean, where are we at? Wow, this is a huge question.
I know.
I don't think Lottie Reiniger had to answer this question.
No, she didn't. She did.
Well, I mean, right now it feels like Disney is going the route of less romance, more family intergenerational trauma. And it feels like they've been doing that for a little while, though it took them a minute, I think, to go fully in that direction. where are they at with romance, and where as a culture are we? Gosh, we've had a lot happen in the last 3 years that's completely changed the way people approach
Yes.
dating and friendship. Pandemic.
I'm basically asking you, what is the meaning of life right now?
Yeah, gosh.
I'm sorry.
I mean, I think if the question is there still maybe a place for a Cinderella-like story? I think the answer is very definitively yes. However, I think not just our present generation, but even starting in the 60s, and really even starting in the 50s, I think there was an understanding that maybe having somebody see somebody one night at a ball and then chase them to the ends of the earth and then marry them wasn't that realistic. Not that a fairy tale has to be realistic. It's fairy tale.
No.
Like, I think that that's the point. But it does feel like for us to maybe even just connect more and believe it more, you need to meet the prince, or Cinderella and the prince need to meet before they actually are dancing at the ball. And that does start happening pretty early. Walt Disney Studios considered it for the 1950 film. They actually considered having him be out hunting, which is what does happen in the 2015 film.
And the 1922 version.
Yes, yeah, and the 1922 version. And also they meet when he's hunting in a German, I think it's a Czech version, I think, called Three Hazelnuts for Cinderella, but it's very popular in Germany and in Scandinavia and in the Czech Republic.
Yes.
Let me see who did it was a multi-country production.
Is that the one where the Cinderella is a brunette and she has like this pink veil?
Yes, yeah,
like
that's that one. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, it's Czech and German. Triorisky pro Popolku. I am sure I did not pronounce that right. That's the Czech name. In most languages, it's translated as it would be translated as Three Hazelnuts for Cinderella. In English, I believe it's translated as Three Wishes for Cinderella. But in that one, she also meets the prince early when he is out hunting. And so you get a lot of this happening in almost all YA versions now. The Cinderella character meets the prince early and they have a connection form. It happens in the 1960s version of the Rodgers and Hammerstein one with Leslie Ann Warren. It happens in the 1997 Brandy one. So you have all these connections with the prince earlier. So I do think maybe if the question is, where are we as a culture with romance? I think it's that we are kind of past this. You meet and have one magical night where you're both kind of in disguise and then you're together for the rest of your life. I think we like to see that a relationship builds and that there's a reason for them to be together other than the fairy tale logic of they are supposed to be together. I mean, not that there's much more to it in the Rodgers and Hammerstein versions, but at least in like the 1997 Brandy version, they share this really beautiful song where they both have these dreams of meeting the right one for them. So, they have a similar mindset and they have a really good conversation where he asks her how she thinks women should be treated. And he says, like a princess, I suppose. And she says, no, like a person.
With kindness and respect.
Yeah, exactly. So they have this like nice connection. And I think that we do look for that, which obviously neither of these 1922 versions does. They're both very short, for one thing, and they're both following more traditional narratives. Though, interestingly, we do have an extended, repetitive shot of the prince hunting in the Disney version.
I'm sorry, that was a really deep rabbit hole that I just put you through, and you handled that marvelously. So we'll probably get further into why that is the way it is in like other like future fairy tale adaptations, but I'd say that's a good kickoff point. And then let's see. Then she leaves at midnight, and the prince gives this. Was it a jester?
I think it might have just been a
Okay.
courtier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's silhouette cutouts. It's a little hard
I
to tell.
know. But then he offers him a bag of money to go out and find the woman whose foot fits the gold slipper.
Hmm.
And he tries it on the stepsister's feet, and they're both bleeding because they have cut off their toes and their heels. As you
Hmm.
know, the Grimms love their gore.
Hmm.
Um, and the stepmother buries Cinderella in the basement.
Hmm.
And then the birds come and they are like, oh, it's not the bride that you have on your horse is not the one you're intended to be with. Which is great because they're practically dying. Um, and then Cinderella just pops out from the bottom and they put on the slipper and it fits. And the stepmother breaks in half.
Sure.
Yeah.
She's made of paper.
She's
It
made of
happens.
paper, but yeah, I don't know if I prefer. Well, I guess I do prefer that over the actual ending where they are invited to her wedding.
Well, they're not in the Grimms. In the Grimms, well, depending on which version you read, it gets worse and worse for them with every consecutive version. But by the end, the stepsisters have their eyes pecked out by birds. So they're not forgiven in the Grimms, but they are forgiven and invited to the wedding and married off to noblemen in the Perot.
Yeah, which is interesting because you'd think that in a more traditional Christian story that they would be
It,
forgiven.
it goes a little bit more Old Testament.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Good really does triumph over evil. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, that's the end of that one.
Yeah, so that's the Grimms, and then the Lottie Reiniger version is very much based on that.
Yeah. Yep. And then Disney with Perot, he turns it into this jazz age
Mhm.
American piece. And it's weird because we have castles, we have kings and princes, but they are located on what is essentially Main Street, USA.
Mhm. Yeah, there's even, like you were talking about his paper route, there's even a bit where he has to throw his newspapers.
Yes.
Like they're invitations to the ball, but it's sort of the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and then this Cinderella, who is named Susie, the recurring character from the Lifograms, her stepsisters also leave her. The fairy godmother appears, and she's provided with a God, I don't even know what model car it is.
I don't know, a model. It looks like a Model T.
Yeah, I'll take your
It's
word for it.
It's definitely an older one. But again, these would have been very contemporary. Like, I think
Yeah.
what's really fascinating with this version, so the Lottie Reiniger version costumes the characters in their silhouettes very much in a fantasy, but 19th or 18th century fantasy world. It kind of follows the silhouette art follows illustrations that you see from 18th and 19th century versions of this work, whereas the Disney 1922 Cinderella makes it incredibly contemporary. So she's
Hmm.
taking a car to the ball, and it's like the newest model, and I think you mentioned a second ago, she's jazz age looking. So she's in this little flapper dress with this headband with a feather, and she's wearing the most fashionable new style. She has bobbed hair, the most fashionable hairstyle, like almost haircutting joke, but it's cutting edge. But it is just like, yeah. But she is, I think it's really interesting how modern the Cinderella character and that transformation ends up being, even though you have the prince on, I mean, obviously people were still hunting in the 1920s, but he's on
Mm-hmm.
more of what seems like a traditional hunt and like a medievalish kind of sense, or a, early modern kind of sense.
Mm-hmm. And then they arrive at the ball with Julius, and they're basically doing like a foxtrot in the
They are.
ballroom.
Yeah, I actually can tell you exactly what kind of dance I believe it is because I researched that.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find it. I might be able to get it up. That's okay. It doesn't matter. I can't remember what it was called. But yeah, it was an incredibly up to the moment dance that they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, basically a foxtrot.
Yeah, yeah. And she arrives, and the prince is obviously enamored with her, and they embrace in the moonlight, as one does. Yeah, I think it's supposed to be another reflection, like in the 1950 Cinderella, where they have this dog who I believe is the prince's companion, and Julius is Cinderella's companion, and they also meet and fall in love.
Mm-hmm.
And then clock strikes 12, she gets out of there, and then they had an interesting effect where she's running down the street, and her scullery outfit runs behind her and then flips into being. Which, for the time, I think that was a pretty good effect.
Well, especially for Disney for the time, because he was, yeah, like he was so at a disadvantage when it came to animation, just by virtue of like where he lived and his lack of finances.
Mm-hmm.
So, you mentioned he took the one animation or cartooning course at the Art Institute of Chicago. And
Yeah.
then he sort of anecdotally famously checked out Edwin G. Lutz's book, like cartoon animation, from the library because he couldn't afford his own copy, and essentially taught himself from this book about how to animate. And he and Ub Iwerks just took it from there, and they had no funds. He was very overconfident in a lot of ways. He incorporated Laugh-O-Gram Inc. and it went bankrupt within months. So
Yeah.
he was, but that seems like his personality. Thank God he had Roy once he got to Los Angeles. Roy kept that thing financially going. But he was the ideas man, and he really believed in himself, which you gotta have. But yeah, I think the effects in it are not as good as what the leading animators, like you mentioned, Paul Terry doing Terry Toons. Terry Toons was, I think you said it was, he was sort of trying to compete with Terry Toons. And I don't know if it was necessarily a competition. I think he was definitely inspired by Terry Toons. And in the way that Terry was linking his name to Aesop's Fables, Disney wanted to link his name to traditional fairy tales. And he has successfully done that. Well done,
Yes.
Walt Disney. That was kind of his goal, I think, from the beginning, was to find his niche, and that was going to be fairy tales. So the Laugh-O-Grams aren't technically great, but they're not bad, both, as you said, for the time, and then also for his level of learning and experience and expertise.
Yes. And that in itself is something that I think is worth like getting this deep into his filmography, because I know that like basically every Disney movie podcast starts at Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and then moves onward strictly through that canon. But here I want to get more of like a detailed like overview of how he evolved, how his art style evolved, how his visions evolved. It just, we know that you can't come out of the gate with something like Snow White day one.
No. It is genuinely like miraculous that he went from his 1922 little 21-year-old self with that level of animation to Snow White in 15, 16 years. It's really incredible, and it, I think, is a testament not only to him, but to the other innovators in the field who were doing so much with animation, with sound design, with color design, that was just starting to take off in those years. So you had a lot of technological stuff that helped him along, but then also his own desire to learn and to seek out really good collaborators and to be inspired by and to take bits from other people. Like I can't remember if it was Mortimer or if they did it with Mickey too, or if it started with Oswald. But like those characters, they were looking at Otto Mesmer's Felix the Cat a lot, because Felix the Cat was one of the earliest tunes to, instead of like they used rounded limbs for Felix. So
Yeah.
he was very round, and that made him a lot more personable rather than sort of angled and sharp. And Disney looks at Felix the Cat and is like, I need to start doing that. And boy, howdy, does he do that, and makes it even more memorable and smoother than Felix the Cat. Though my cat was named Felix. So, and he was a tuxedo baby. So, yeah.
No
Felix
shade,
the
Felix.
Cat. Yeah, Felix the Cat still has a place in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was Otto Mesmer that did Felix, I believe. Yeah.
Thought it was yeah.
Yeah. Because it wasn't the Fleischers, I don't think. Yeah, Otto Mesmer. Yeah.
But did Pat Sullivan have anything to do with that?
Yes,
or am I thinking of something else?
It was produced by Pat Sullivan Studio. Yeah, you are correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank goodness.
But yeah, so this is, I think, a pretty cute, good little version of Cinderella. What is most interesting to me about it is that, as far as I can tell, it is the first ever animated or fully animated version of Cinderella. You know, you have the Lottie Reiniger that comes out the same year. So those two, if it came out first, then I guess it's the first Cinderella, but it's Aschenputtel, you know? So if you're looking at the two different traditions, if you're looking at the Perrault Cinderella and the Grimm's Aschenputtel, Disney has the first animated Cinderella. And then there are multiple short tunes of Cinderella until the 1950 version. And there's more after that. There's a Popeye version in 1953 called Ancient Fish Story. So you get all of these different versions throughout. And I just find it really interesting that Disney managed to somehow be the first for this really iconic tale.
Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone touched Sleeping Beauty in like a straightforward adaptation until Disney. And then Snow White, technically the Fleischers beat him to it. Yeah. I don't, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, I do love me some St. James Infirmary blues, but God, it's weird.
Yep. There's issues.
Yeah. Yep. I am surprised that that's one thing that Disney can take credit for.
Yeah. Though I have to say, I don't think that it actually influenced very much to do with Cinderella history, except for maybe Disney's own conception of the story. So I think it's an important building block for thinking about the Disney Corporation and maybe how Disney saw himself. But it was not a widely distributed short. It was thought to be lost for years and years. And I think something that can be hard to remember in our world, where we can go to YouTube and find almost any old piece of media pretty quickly and easily, is that, I mean, even in our parents' generation, you couldn't go and get like animated films to watch at home. Like until the late 80s, you couldn't see Disney animated films at home unless they were airing on television or for their theatrical re-release. So Disney kept making money on their films, not by selling them on home video or having them on a streaming service, but by having them go back into the cinemas every year. And so I think we forget that you couldn't access media once it was out of the cinema. Like that was it. It was gone. So in addition to this version not having particularly wide distribution and then being thought to be lost, like I don't think that like Tex Avery probably watched this video and had any kind of feeling about it one way or the other.
No. But I guess I hadn't really thought of it as being a local Cinderella.
Yeah.
So... Well, that crushes some dreams. I don't know. Or notions, preconceived notions.
They were trying to get distributors out of New York. The Laugh-O-Gram story is pretty interesting and a little bit complicated, and the promises that were made for various funds that were then not paid out to them. And they were trying to talk with some distributors in New York. There was a woman that they were talking to in particular, and I cannot think of her name
Margaret
right now.
Winkler?
Yeah, Margaret Winkler. Thank you. But like things kind of seemed like a go with her, and then they weren't, and then they were. So it just, yeah, Laugh-O-Grams are a really weird episode in the Walt Disney story.
Yep, we still have to tackle them in our next episode on the Alice comedies.
Yeah, the Alice comedies were like the only financially lucrative thing to come out of the whole Laugh-O-Gram business.
Yep. Oh, and that was such a headache to research.
I can imagine.
Yep. But yeah, I guess the only other details we left out was the prince was searching for her, like literally checking out her footprints in the street, and he comes upon a duck that's wearing shoes. Yep, it's pretty duckable.
Oh, no.
And then he found the stepfamily, tried the shoe on, didn't work on either of them, put it on Cinderella, and then it's just very abrupt. It fits.
Yeah.
Let's make out.
The end. Yeah.
The end. It's kind of like a diet Cinderella.
It's like 7 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is a short movie, but it's like it's very, very efficient. Very, very efficient.
To be fair, fairy tales are pretty efficient, and we've just made them inefficient.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, the Perrault's only a couple pages. The Grimms are only a couple pages.
Yeah. Didn't Madame Delanoy do an adaptation, or am I thinking of Beauty and the Beast?
I think you're thinking of Finette Cindron, which she did do. Madame Delanoy did that, which came out the same year as the Perrault, and it has some resonances with what we consider the Cinderella story, but it has enough differences that it's not a straight Cinderella story in any way.
Okay. Because I know I talked about that, for some context for the listeners. I took a college course in high school, and one of our subjects for the semester was the Cinderella myth, which is just basically about how fairy tales disappoint you as young adults and stuff. And that version was thrown out along with the Perrault and the Grimms. So I was just wondering how much of a connection it had.
I don't think that it is. So Cinderella is considered an Arne Thompson Uther, which is the categorization mechanism that scholars and folklorists use for fairy tales and folklores. So Cinderella is categorized as ATU 510A, and ATU 510B is like donkey skin or cat skin. And
yes.
Yeah. And Finette Cindron combines another type, which is 327A and 510A. And I don't exactly know what 327A would necessarily be considered, but there's much more of a journey. There's like still some evil stepsisters or some mean stepsisters, but they kind of get along okay at the end. Yeah, it's a whole big complicated thing about like finding acorns and planting it, and sisters stealing things from her. They end up in an ogre's castle. Yeah, it's a whole big journey. It's not just like she works at home and then goes to a ball. So yeah, Finette Cindron is very different, but there is a fairy godmother in it. But there were fairy godmothers in quite a few of the stories from the French salon culture, which I think we touched on a bit last time when we talked. So yeah.
Well, I think that's fair, well-rounded discussion of both adaptations. I don't even know if I should ask you our final question, because we've technically answered it already.
Okay.
But if you had to You could stick with your answer, or we could maybe pluck something else out. I'm not sure. But how do you think at the very least the Laugh-O-Gram version of Cinderella influenced the way that the Disney studio produces films to this day?
Mm. I mean, I think not a lot. I think it was a learning experience for Disney. So, in the sense of how it guided the studio forward to where it has gotten, I think that, Disney learned, the man, Walt,
Mhm.
learned a lot from that experience, as did, I am sure, his collaborators, including Byworks, who did most of the animation. Walt, I mean, by the time we get to Snow White, Walt's not actually animating anything himself anymore. He's just
Yeah,
sort of the
no.
head of the studio. He wasn't a very good animator. He was a good storyteller and had really good ideas, was a good ideas man. Um, so I would say it probably wasn't influential to a larger, broader culture. But I
Mhm.
think in terms of how the studio developed, that was it was another stepping stone for
Yeah.
learning the art of animation, for learning business, for learning how to distribute films. And then also, I think there's something really telling in the way that in Walt's Cinderellas, including the 1950 version, people say that she's so passive and this, that, the other. But I don't think that Walt saw her as being passive at all. I think Walt identified very strongly with the character of Cinderella. And I think he saw her as being kind and being a little bit sassy. Like she has a few moments where, she makes fun in the 1950 version. She makes fun of the stepsisters singing a little bit. She calls it the
Mhm.
music lesson with an eye roll, and has
Yes.
a few other moments where you can see
Yeah.
that personality coming through. And there's been I think we talked last time, there have been some really good arguments about why Cinderella isn't passive. But I don't think that Walt saw her as passive. I think he really identified with a character who was a bit of an underdog. And I think, what I said earlier about how he was at a disadvantage with his lack of finances, with his geographical location in Kansas City rather than in New York, where a lot of the main animation was happening at the time. I think he saw himself as the underdog. I think he saw himself as a Cinderella figure. It is a famous anecdote now that when asked what his favorite moment of animation is, he said it was the moment in the 1950 film when Cinderella transforms. And I think that that's really telling. I think he had a lot of personal investment in the tale. And I think he saw himself and his studio as very much a Cinderella figure through his life. And I do think it's hard now when we look at Disney as this multi-billion-dollar conglomerate to
Yeah. Well,
say,
you alive?
yeah, to be like, they really did have a lot of financial struggles. They were for a while, especially once he first got to LA, and especially during the Laugh-O-Grams, they were the underdog. They needed their fairy godmother in a really real way. So if it influenced in any way, it had more to do with learning and then self-image.
Hmm. I love that. It does not have to be like this overarching thing like I'm making it out to be. But at the very least, it does contribute to the journey, of course. So,
Yeah. Though I think that the Lottie Reiniger one is the better. If we're talking about a
yeah.
battle of the Cinderellas, you got to go with Lottie Reiniger. She just was much more the master of her craft in 1922 than Walt Disney was.
Yeah. In fact,
Yeah.
I was going to say that because you tackled the Disney version, I'd try to come up with an answer for the Reiniger one. um, I think for her, I would say that it affects the way films are made in the sense that international adaptations of fairy tales, like film adaptations, they've always had to compete with Disney.
Hmm.
Always. It is very hard for an adaptation from Germany or from the United Kingdom or from Italy or whatever you want to put as a location. It is hard for them to reach the mainstream in the way that Disney does, partly because of this massive brand and corporation that they have created for themselves. but also just because I think it's because Disney tries to get a pulse of the culture, like the American culture that they're trying to cater to, and sort of see like, okay, not just how can we tell a story that'll profit us exponentially. I mean, look at Frozen. But just sort of like, what kind of story can we tell that resonates with our audiences? And you could say that a lot of the other adaptations, they either go very literal with their interpretation, or they look for something that doesn't necessarily like focus on like heart or emotions.
Yeah, and I think I think the Lottie Reiniger version suffered for a lot of the reasons that the Laugh-O-Grams did. Like once they're out of the cinema, they're out of the cinema. They weren't making it over to America at that point. I think that the English language one we watched was maybe a 1928 one where we had the English subtitles instead of the German. I read somewhere that there was a review of it in Britain in 1928. So I think maybe it took it 6 years to get to Britain. Though, again, I'm not the Lottie Reiniger expert, so I could be wrong. But then the films just were not available to an English-speaking public after they were gone. So I think that, it suffers from that. And then I also, in my reading on Lottie Reiniger, in Germany at the time, there was a vogue for realism was coming in, and she was not doing realism. She was doing fantasy and silhouette art. So like you were saying, it maybe wasn't plugging into the pulse of where mainstream art was going in Germany at the time. Though I believe The Adventures of Prince Ahmed was very successful. So there's also that to consider.
Yeah. Well, maybe it would have been considered like an art house film or something. It was in like a niche market.
I'm not sure. I don't know anything about the 1920s German film market.
That's totally fine. It's just a hypothetical thing I'm putting out into the ether. We'll find out on that episode. But yeah. Any final thoughts on Cinderellas?
Oh, I have so many. But no, I think we've done a really good job today covering a lot of ground.
All right. I'm pretty satisfied too. Well, I guess that concludes this chapter of Disney Reel to Reel. Abigail, you are one of my troopers in this journey. So thank you so much for sticking with me.
You are welcome. This has been great.
Yeah. And I look forward to many more adventures in the future.
Yep.
We'll try not to make them focus on Cinderella every time, but we'll see what happens. So yeah, I guess until next time, have a magical day, everybody.
No, das ist mein Pantoffel.
Sehen en pas perfekt. Euer Hoheit, ich glaube, diese Pantoffel gehört mir.
Heilige Holla, mein Darm.
Oh, du bist es. Oh, und das ist für dich, Stiefmutter.
So lasst uns alle fröhlich singen und alle Glocken klingen. Das Leben, es lag mir